The year is 23 years before the birth of Christ, a summer evening in a villa on the Bay of Naples. The house belongs to Marcus Vedius Pollio, a man who was born into nothing and now owns everything, including the 47 slaves who staff this single property among his dozen estates scattered across the Italian peninsula. A young slave named Demetrius stands frozen at the edge of the dining room, a silver wine pitcher trembling in his hands. 3 drops of Falernian wine have just splashed onto the mosaic floor. The droplets are smaller than tears. They will change his life forever. Vedius Pollio has stopped mid-sentence. His dinner guests, 7 of Rome's most powerful senators and their wives, have fallen silent. The only sound is the distant splash of water in the ornamental fish pond that dominates the villa's central courtyard. That fish pond is famous throughout Rome, not for its beauty, for what lives in it. Pollio raises one finger. 2 guards step forward, seizing Demetrius by the arms. The boy does not struggle. He knows struggling makes it worse. He has seen what happens to slaves who spill things in this house. He has heard the sounds from the courtyard on nights when Pollio entertains. He has watched other slaves walk toward that fish pond and not walk back. The pond contains lampreys, moray eels imported from the waters off Sicily, specially bred for size and aggression, kept perpetually hungry, so they will perform when Pollio requires entertainment. The punishment for minor infractions in this household is to be thrown into the pond alive. The eels can strip flesh from bone in minutes. Pollio has timed it. Demetrius is dragged toward the courtyard. He can see the black water ahead, can see the shapes moving beneath the surface, can hear the wet sounds of creatures anticipating food. The dinner guests have risen from their couches to watch. One senator's wife is smiling. Another is looking away, but not leaving, not objecting, not doing anything except bearing witness to what Roman hospitality apparently includes. This is the moment when something unexpected happens. One of the dinner guests steps forward. He is younger than the others, quieter, a man who has spent the evening observing more than speaking. His name is not recorded in the account that survives, but his actions are. He places himself between Demetrius and the pond. He looks at Pollio and says words that no guest should say to a host, words that challenge a wealthy Roman's absolute right over his own property. He says that what is about to happen is wrong. Pollio's face contorts with rage. The guest has violated every rule of Roman social conduct. A man's slaves are his own. What he does with them is no one's business. To interfere is to insult the host's dignity, to question his judgment, to suggest that his entertainment is somehow improper. The confrontation lasts several minutes. Other guests remain frozen, unwilling to support either side. Finally, Pollio makes a decision that reveals something important about Roman elite culture. He releases Demetrius. Not because he agrees that feeding slaves to eels is wrong, because the confrontation has ruined the entertainment. A spectacle requires enthusiastic spectators. A single objection transforms theater into awkwardness. But Pollio does not forget, and Pollio does not forgive. The guest who intervened will face consequences that unfold over years, subtle destructions of reputation and opportunity that cannot be traced back to this evening but originate here. In this moment, when someone suggested that Roman elite entertainment had crossed a line, here is what you need to understand. Vedius Pollio was not considered exceptional among Roman elites. He was not shunned for his lamprey pond. He was not excluded from polite society. He continued hosting dinners attended by Rome's most powerful families. His only mistake in Roman eyes was being too obvious about practices that other wealthy Romans conducted with more discretion. The Roman elite maintained secrets that they systematically erased from official histories. What survived in the historical record is what could be admitted publicly. What did not survive, what was hidden and denied and destroyed, reveals a ruling class whose private practices exceeded anything their public monuments suggest. Tonight, You will learn 17 secrets that Rome's elite tried to bury. Not the crimes of mad emperors, which have been documented extensively, the crimes of ordinary aristocrats. Senators who sat in judgment of others while practicing abominations in their own homes. Matrons celebrated for their virtue who participated in rituals that would have meant death for common citizens. Families whose names represented Roman honor for generations while their private conduct violated every principle they publicly championed. These were not isolated incidents. These were systematic practices maintained across centuries by a ruling class that believed their wealth and status exempted them from the moral standards they imposed on everyone else. The evidence was deliberately destroyed, but fragments survived in unexpected places. Private letters that escaped burning, graffiti preserved by volcanic ash, legal documents that mentioned crimes without describing them fully, archaeological remains that tell stories written records tried to hide. What you are about to hear comes from those surviving fragments, pieces of a puzzle that Roman elites spent centuries trying to ensure would never be assembled. They failed. And tonight, 2,000 years later, their secrets finally come to light. Before we descend into this darkness together, if you value content that exposes the hidden truths of history, subscribe and hit the notification bell. Comment below telling me where in the world you are listening from. These stories were buried deliberately by people who had every reason to keep them hidden. They deserve to be heard by everyone willing to confront what lies beneath the marble facades of Roman civilization. Let us begin with what really happened at Roman dinner parties, because the banquet was where elite secrets were both practiced and protected. You have seen depictions of Roman banquets in films and television, reclining figures on couches, servants bringing elaborate dishes, wine flowing freely, civilized conversation among the educated and powerful. These depictions are accurate as far as they go. They simply omit what happened after the formal dinner ended. Roman elite banquets operated on two levels. The official dinner, the cena, followed strict protocols of hospitality. Guests arrived at specific hours. Courses were served in specific sequences. Conversation topics were appropriate for mixed company. This portion of the evening could be discussed publicly, referenced in letters, mentioned in speeches. The second level, the commissatio, began after the main meal concluded. This was the drinking party that followed dinner, and it operated under entirely different rules. What happened during the commissatio was understood to be private. Guests who discussed it publicly violated social codes that could result in permanent exclusion from elite circles. A poet named Martial wrote about commissatio practices in terms that required readers to understand implications rather than explicit statements. He references senators who arrive at dinners with their wives and leave with other arrangements. He mentions matrons whose behavior after the third wine course would shock their morning visitors. He describes scenes witnessed through half-open doors that participants would deny the next day. The practices Martial implies were confirmed by other sources. Seneca wrote philosophical condemnations of banquet behavior that reveal what he was condemning. Pliny the Elder documented what he called the corruption of the dining room in terms that suggest intimate activities occurring among dinner guests as routine entertainment. The mechanics operated through understood signals. Certain gestures indicated availability. Certain responses indicated interest. Certain arrangements of couches facilitated what would follow. Slaves were trained to recognize these signals and to facilitate arrangements without explicit instruction. The entire system functioned through implication rather than statement, allowing participants to maintain the fiction that nothing unusual was occurring. A wealthy widow named Sempronia hosted banquets in the late Republic that became famous for their commissatio entertainment. The historian Sallust, writing about the conspiracy of Catiline, mentions her parties as gathering places for men planning treason. But between the lines of his political narrative, he reveals something else. Sempronia's parties featured what he calls every kind of entertainment, with guests participating in activities that respectable women supposedly never witnessed, much less facilitated. The slave infrastructure supporting these banquets was extensive. Beautiful slaves of both genders were displayed during dinner, their availability understood by all present. Guests could request specific slaves through subtle signals to the host. The slaves themselves had no voice in these arrangements. Their bodies were simply amenities, like the silver dinnerware or the imported wines. What made elite banquets particularly disturbing was the combination of sophistication and exploitation. These were educated people discussing philosophy and poetry and politics, while simultaneously treating other human beings as objects for entertainment. The cognitive dissonance was not experienced as contradiction. It was simply how civilized Romans lived. A fragment from the Satyricon, a novel written during Nero's reign, depicts a banquet at the house of a wealthy freedman named Trimalchio. The scene is satirical, mocking the excesses of the newly rich. But the satire works only because readers recognize the practices being exaggerated. The intimate entertainments, the casual use of slaves, the blurring of boundaries during the drinking hours, these were familiar enough to elite Romans that they could appreciate the comedy. The banquet system persisted for centuries because it served social functions beyond entertainment. Alliances were formed during commissatio. Political deals were sealed. Business arrangements were concluded. The shared participation in private activities created bonds of complicity that made betrayal dangerous. Everyone present had witnessed everyone else. Mutual blackmail potential ensured mutual silence. But the banquets were only one setting for elite secrets. What happened in the slave markets revealed something even darker about Roman aristocratic values. Rome's slave markets operated publicly, in the Forum, and in specialized facilities throughout the city. Tens of thousands of human beings were bought and sold annually. The markets were regulated, taxed, and considered entirely normal commercial activity. What the public markets offered was general labor. Agricultural workers, domestic servants, craftsmen, laborers. The selection process for these slaves was straightforward. Buyers assessed physical condition, skills, and temperament. Prices reflected utility. Transactions were recorded for tax purposes. The elite did not buy their slaves in public markets. A parallel system existed for wealthy purchasers, operating through private dealers who specialized in what the Romans called delicia, delights. These were slaves selected for attributes beyond labor capacity: beauty, youth, specific physical characteristics, training in specific arts. The selection process for deliciae was conducted privately, away from public observation, with protocols that would have caused scandal if widely known. A dealer named Tyrannus became wealthy in the late Republic by specializing in deliciae procurement for elite clients. His business records, fragments of which survived in legal disputes after his death, reveal a sophisticated operation. Agents throughout the Mediterranean identified promising acquisitions. Subjects were purchased young and trained in specialized facilities. The training included what the records euphemistically call education in the arts of pleasing. Elite buyers would visit Tyrannus's private showrooms, where slaves were displayed in ways that emphasized the qualities being sold. The viewing process was hands-on. Buyers were encouraged to inspect thoroughly, to verify that the merchandise met their requirements. The slaves being inspected had no rights, no voice, no recourse. They were products being evaluated by consumers. A senator named Quintus Lutatius Catulus maintained a household famous for the beauty of its slaves. His contemporary Cicero made references to Catulus's domestic arrangements in terms that suggest more than aesthetic appreciation. The senator's collection was acquired through dealers like Tyrannus, selected according to criteria that had nothing to do with household management. The prices for deliciae vastly exceeded ordinary slave prices. A skilled agricultural worker might cost 2,000 sesterces. A beautiful youth with appropriate training might cost 200,000. The investment represented indicated the purpose. No one paid that premium for someone to clean floors. The training facilities where deliciae were prepared operated in legal ambiguity. What happened in them was not discussed in polite company. But their existence was acknowledged, their products were purchased, and their graduates populated the households of Rome's most respected families. What became of deliciae slaves as they aged reveals the system's full cruelty. Youth and beauty fade. Slaves purchased for these qualities lost their value rapidly. Some were resold at declining prices as their primary utility diminished. Some were freed